excited to be kicking off the day with a conversation about community adaptation and resilience, and kind of a little bit of the nuts and bolts implementation of some of the stuff that we were hearing about yesterday, some of the work that Merrick was talking about. And I know he mentioned a few times, he said, oh, well, Michelle will talk about that tomorrow. There were some questions about community adaptation and what that might look like. So we're going to hear from three folks today. We're going to have Michelle Medley Daniel, Ashley Downing, and Helen Moore. Helen, did you manage to make it back on? Are you here? Yes, there you are. I see you. Okay,
I'm
good.
here.
I'm glad
Thank
that
you.
passcode worked. Okay, cool. Yeah, and Helen, especially thank you to you for joining at the last possible second. We're really grateful to have you on board. And yeah, these three are just going to talk about, what that implementation looks like in a few different parts of the country, and how communities are working to create some more fire adapted spaces, and what that workforce need looks like, and how the money's flowing and stuff like that. So I'm going to read bios, and then we're going to kick off with Michelle. Michelle Medley Daniel is Deputy Director of the Watershed Center and Director of their Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network based out of Hayfork, California. In her Fire Adapted Communities role, Michelle works alongside partners at the Nature Conservancy to direct the operations of a national network of communities learning to live better with wildfire. In particular, her focus is on working with state and regional efforts to launch network-based approaches to wildfire resilience. Ashley Downing is Executive Director of Wildfire Adapted Partnership, a grassroots organization based in Durango, Colorado, that is dedicated to helping homeowners understand their wildfire risk and what they can do to reduce that risk. Ashley also serves on the board of directors for Fire Adapted Colorado, a statewide network that serves individuals and organizations that are committed to reducing the negative impacts of wildfire in the state. And Helen Moore is a forester with the Center for Forest Disturbance, a research unit within the U.S. Forest Service Southern Research Station, and is also director of the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists, one of the knowledge exchange networks. During her 24-year career with the USFS Southern Research Station, she has worked on fuels and vegetation response to fire in the Southern Appalachians, and for the last 12 years has primarily concentrated on consortium work. She is also very active in the operational side of fire, serving as a crew lead or firing boss on prescribed fires and wildfires. So without further ado, Michelle, do you want to share your screen, or do you want us to share?
I can share. I think my internet will hold up.
Okay. I will make you co-host there.
Awesome.
Perfect. You should be all set.
Okay. I think folks should be able to see my screen now. Good morning. Thank you so much to Melissa, Dave, and the Institute for having me join. I'm really excited to engage with all of you today and share a little bit about some of my background and what I've been learning over the past decade plus, working with different communities on their envisioning fire in their places. A little bit about me, as Melissa said, I work for a place-based nonprofit called the Watershed Center in Northern California, but I also work really closely with Merrick Smith, who you heard from yesterday, to co-lead that national set of fire networks. And you also heard from our colleague Lania Quinn Davidson yesterday, who helps us run some of our prescribed fire training exchange work. So this is where I come from. This is my hometown in far Northern California. Trinity County here is a really rural county. I think we have 14,000 people for that entire county. Most of our land is public land, and that's a really kind of unique context. I grew up in this community and went through the timber wars and the changes in our local economy that gave rise to the Watershed Center. When we lost our mill, 40% of our workforce went away overnight, and so we really needed a community solution to creating job retraining. And so the Watershed Center was created initially just to put those loggers and mill workers back to work in the woods. And over the past 30 years of trying to figure out how to stay living in a small rural community in a public lands context, we've learned a lot about what it takes to steward landscapes, and we've really learned a lot about how to live better with fire. So that's one part of my background. The other part of my background that really informs this work is my work with that National Fire Networks partnership. So in 2013, we had, as the Watershed Center, the opportunity to come alongside our partners at the Nature Conservancy and U.S. Forest Service and Department of Interior and ask the question, can we support community-based leaders in wildfire resilience work? The Nature Conservancy and Forest Service and DOI had already been kind of working on the wildfire issue from a landscape perspective for several years and had learned a lot about how to make that work more effective through peer learning. And so we wanted to bring that same kind of approach to community-based work and bring community leaders together. And so for the last 10 plus years, I've been working with community-based leaders in trying to think about the relationship they want to have with fire and how to deal with the realities of fire that they're dealing with. So our partnership is really designed to improve the relationships between people, fire, and place. And we provide folks with connections to each other, to resources, to funding for projects. And importantly, we really try to learn from them about their solutions so we can move those into to changing the system. We have so much funding, which I think you heard about yesterday to some degree, in the wildfire space. And most of that comes from our government partners. And a lot of those programs are kind of designed for agency needs and have some top-down kind of structures. And so our networks are a really important feedback loop in getting community needs and solutions elevated to places that can make other kinds of change. So this morning, I wanted to share a little bit of just kind of framework around what we mean by fire-adapted communities. So I have kind of a who, what, when, where, why of fire-adapted communities, or FAC. And then I have a couple of examples of projects that might not be the first thing that come to mind when we think about working on fire. So first of all, the who. I think lots of us think about fire from the perspective of fire managers, from folks who are actually working either with prescribed fire or on fire suppression. We might think about residents that are impacted by fire, but I don't think we always think about folks that work in public health, folks that run the local nonprofits, folks that are really the community organizers that are able to help people get together, create new visions, and take action, collect funding or gather other assets. And so I think it's just important to recognize that there's a lot of people who can be part of fire adaptation stories, and I really encourage folks to kind of get some of those other perspectives as you're writing stories and trying to understand how communities are engaging with fire. You'll note that we don't try to say what each of these kind of sectors needs to do, because people aren't just one sector, and they, different communities have different roles. And so the point of this graphic is just to illustrate that there are many different kind of stakeholder groups within a fire adapted community partnership. So what is fire adaptation? When we first started FACnet, I think people were sort of using fire adapted communities as a shorthand for residents and the built environment. And there was a lot of kind of the idea of, well, we need to protect life and safety, which is absolutely important. And we also need to get those people out of the way so we can do our jobs. And we recognized that that was kind of a limiting perspective on fire adaptation, and that we really wanted to understand what was actually happening in communities when it came to their conception of their relationship with fire. And so we started talking to people, trying to understand all of the aspects of work they were doing, and we built this kind of FAC wheel to help describe a framework around fire adaptation. And so the inner circle, the teal inner circle, are kind of these buckets of work that we find being really common. They're not a checklist. It's not, these are the things that people have to do. Often people think fire adapted communities is a designation or recognition program. It's not that at all. It's just a framework for thinking about how you're going to interact with fire in your place and with the other community members. And so we created this tool to really help describe that range of issue areas and actions that people could take to engage with fire. And some of these are important in some places and others aren't. And so we actually built a tool that helps communities figure out how to design a strategy around what's most important in their place. You saw my community, it's a tiny little mountain town. We don't have a ton to do with business and infrastructure. We have very limited business and infrastructure here. Landscape treatments are incredibly important in our community because we are surrounded by landscape, and landscape is both an economic tie for us, and it's also one of our most important opportunities to actually engage with fire and shape how fire is going to behave. So every place is going to be on kind of its own pathway with fire, and sort of understanding the range of those things, I think, is really helpful. There's some communities that are trying to return fire process to landscapes. There's some communities where they really need to keep fire out of their neighborhoods. And both of those are really valid things. And so this framework kind of makes space for all of that and helps describe some of the kinds of work and activities that people do. Another important aspect of fire adaptation is really recognizing that it occurs, across the whole fire cycle. So I think sometimes people think about residents and try to place them in this sort of pre-fire mitigation space. And while we absolutely want people being proactive, in communities, we experience fire, and it doesn't, whether we're always, before the next fire and after the last one. And so I think it's important to recognize that there's different things that matter to communities, and that shape their experience along this continuum of pre, during, and after fire. And there's a lot of opportunities we have to redistribute power within our fire management system across this cycle as well. In the during fire part of this cycle right now, communities have very little opportunity to shape what happens, in spite of maybe spending 20 years creating community wildfire protection plans and engaging and thinking about how fire should work on their landscape. And so we have some really cool projects that partners have done to try to help make sure that that community work translates into the actual fire operations space, because right now that's not a guarantee, and there's a lot of missed opportunity to shape the future. So we're working to try to help make clear opportunities for communities to shape the future before, during, and after fire. Where fire is going to play a role, this is like direct and indirect, right? So if I know some folks here are from the Northeast, we don't often think about some of our larger cities in the Northeast when it relates to fire, but you all experienced a lot of wildfire smoke this past summer from the Canadian wildfires. And so fire, it may not be the direct flames or people being evacuated from your community, but fire does affect all of our places, and those places are also changing. And so I think it's really important to recognize that our fire stories aren't just sort of relegated to the back 40 and like those cabins interspersed in the woods anymore. It's really an issue that every community should be thinking about, whether that's to deal with smoke, to recognize that if the community up the road or up the mountain burns down like Paradise did, what's that going to do to your housing stock? If you're Chico, California, you need to be thinking about that. So there's a lot of connectivity for receiving communities from fires. And so there's just many different relationships in terms of the where. There's also, communities that are growing and expanding into different kinds of landscapes, and communities that are not growing or are changing in terms of their relationship to land. And so recognizing we can't create like a static plan for how to deal with fire in place, because place is not static, is really important, and I think makes this issue even harder to grapple with. And then finally, why should we think about fire in terms of fire adapted communities? And in our National Fire Network's work, we've really embraced the idea and recognized how important it is to really think about our fire issues as cultural issues instead of just as ecological issues. We've had so many amazing interactions with the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network and with many of our Indigenous members of our other networks who've really helped people see that we have options when it comes to our relationship with fire, and we can shape better futures with fire if we really think about this issue as one that's about the relationship between people, fire, and place, instead of just one that's about how do we make those fuels behave the way we want them to. And so I think it's a really powerful framing to recognize that this is about balancing relationships over time. So I want to share a couple of quick examples of work that people are doing in place, and then turn it over to my colleagues, Ashley and Helen. So as I said, in my community in far Northern California, we have been focused for a long time in HAFE work on workforce development. We had all these loggers and mill workers who were out of a job, and we wanted to think about how to create a system that could put them back to work. And so the top picture there, like, this might look like what you would expect to see from a workforce in land stewardship and fire stewardship. And we have that opportunity in my place, and that's been an incredible way to both create jobs and create a real relationship to fire and landscape that's very direct. But that's not the only kinds of jobs we really need in this sector. And so I want to draw our attention also to the fact that we need artists, and we need landscape architects, and we need builders, and we need inspectors, and we need policymakers, and we need musicians, and we're going to need case managers and mental health practitioners. So there are so many different roles that we might not think of as fire jobs that we really need to be investing in if we're going to position ourselves to actually have a better relationship with fire. And so I'd love us to think about workforce development in a really expansive way. And I think it's awesome that we're working to get more diverse and different people into fire and land management itself. But then I think we can also continue expanding that idea and recognize the power of other sectors as well. Equity is such a huge issue in fire adapted communities, outcomes. I think there's so much more recognition of this over the last several years around how unequal impacts are from wildfires and other kinds of natural hazards across our populations and communities. And I've been really excited. Several of our network members have been trying to really address this issue in a proactive way. And instead of just using kind of biophysical models to understand where their fire risk was and to design their projects and programs, they are really trying to bring demographic information into their planning process. So the City of Austin's fire department was working on updating their community wildfire protection plan and rethinking where they were going to prioritize work. And if they just had looked at the landscape and thought about where fires were likely to happen, they would have a very different prioritization map than they do now, because they brought in information about where they had expanding populations, where they had folks who didn't have English as their primary language, and they've had such a richer conversation with their whole community, and it's shaped a lot of their work to engage not just with where do we think fire is going to come from first, but how do we make sure our entire community is involved in thinking about our relationship with fire and making sure that all of their needs are met. And so I see this as a trend that's happening in community-based work, where people really are becoming more aware of their whole communities, not just working in the neighborhoods that have the homeowners associations, but really trying to address needs throughout their entire community. And then the last example I want to give is an example in Southern Oregon, where our partners in Ashland have been working on really a lot of different elements of fire adaptation. They have amazing landscape treatment programs, and they work with Prescribed Fire to manage their municipal watershed. And they have all of these kind of flagship programs that you might imagine. They do a lot of structure hardening. But they also have an economy that's based on an outdoor theater. And so they really recognized how critical having a different approach to dealing with smoke was going to be. For a long time, people in the fire community were just kind of like, prescribed fire smoke is better than wildfire smoke, just deal with smoke. And I think we've realized that that is not sufficient. Smoke is really bad for humans, and we need to be coming up with strategies that actually help us take care of ourselves regardless of the smoke's origins. And so we've seen a lot of folks in the network recognize how important coming up with programs to actually equip people to protect themselves from the impacts of smoke are. And we have a whole community clean air program now that's working in several different communities across the country. But the folks in Ashland were really some of the first ones to do these programs. And they were so successful because they really built a partnership with their Chamber of Commerce, their local hospital, and they were very deliberate about thinking about all of the kind of incentives and drivers in their community around smoke. So with that, I want to leave you with just a couple of maybe thoughts around community fire adaptation in particular. So I think a great question to ask people is what relationship they want to have with fire. I think we need more people who are really imagining a different future with fire. I think it's very easy to, look at the situation, at the models, at the insurance situation, and be really daunted and sort of downtrodden and feel like, what are we going to do? And I think only with people who continue to try to have kind of a radical imagination are we going to come up with other pathways and be able to continue like marching away to do this work. And so I really encourage that question. I also think it's really important to recognize that community can be a verb and not just a place. I think that too often we think of community as this like just the built environment. Oh, it's just those residents. How are we going to get them to do what we want them to do? It becomes this acting on an audience instead of celebrating the fact that where I see real progress and resilience is where people are actually understanding one another, connecting, taking care of each other, and recognizing that one of the ways to manage shared risk is through shared relationship. That kind of goes along with this idea of adaptive capacity and that we need to be investing in that. So what I mean by adaptive capacity is that it's going to take, we don't know what it's going to take to live in the future with fire. We know that what we're doing right now is not getting good outcomes. And so we need to be investing in visionary leaders and people who are innovating and trying to figure out how things can be better. So instead of just buying acres and buying things we already know how to buy, we really need to change our thinking and recognize that our ability to adapt, to see our resources and assets and figure out how to reorganize those and use those, that's going to be incredibly important in a context where so many systems are failing at once. There's a lot of different viable pathways to fire. Not everybody has to be on a path to, bring fire back to their community. I love that journey. That's like my own community, but that's not everybody's, and that's fine. Social and cultural dimensions are absolutely critical. They're just as important as our biophysical ones. And then lastly, storytelling helps us create change. And so I just am excited about the stories that you all are going to write. I love reading and learning about what's happening with fire, the tragedies and the successes. It's so important that there's more stories that help us understand the range of possibilities when it comes to fire. So thanks again for having me. I'm really excited to hear the next talks and engage with your questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Michelle. That was great. That was really helpful. Ashley, are you ready?
Yes, I think I need permission to share.
Yep. Okay. Yep. I will do that. There you go. You should be all set now.
Okay, great. Great. Yeah, welcome everyone. So my name is Ashley Downing. I am the executive director for Wildfire Adapted Partnership. Does my screen look okay? Does everyone see the presentation?
Yep.
So I've been in my role for 6 years now, and we are a nonprofit organization located in Durango, Colorado, is where I'm coming from today. And so today I just wanted to give a little background. Michelle did a great job of an overarching view of kind of what fire adapted communities looks like, or those ideas behind it. And I wanted to share a little bit about how we implement this idea in our area of Colorado. So our organization, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. Although we did not start out that way, we started out as like a community effort that had a fiscal agent, and so we grew over time and be able to get big enough to become our own nonprofit. And really, we came out, and we truly are grassroots in the fact that we came out of an effort from local residents after 70,000 acres burned north of Durango. So this was in 2002. We lost 46 homes and cabins from the Missionary Ridge Fire. And they interested residents went to Durango Fire Protection District and kind of said, how can we protect ourselves for next time? What can we do and put in place to be better prepared? So Durango Fire, in combination with the NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, they had a 2-day workshop in 2003, and out of that came Firewise of Southwest Colorado, and that was our name until 2018, and we became Wildfire Adapted Partnership. So we have been around for 20 years now. And our mission is to inspire, educate, and enable individuals and communities to protect lives and property from wildfire. So we are really focused on communities and individuals, building efforts really in defensible space, so up to 150 feet from the home, or also just community preparedness of safe evacuation, shaded field breaks, looking not so much in large acres, but really important acres that are close to structures. And we accomplish our mission through a two-pronged approach. One of them is our mitigation incentive program. So mitigation can be expensive for individuals, so we try to help offset some of those expenses. And I will go into a short summary of our programs here in a second. And the second one is our education and outreach program. So really educating people of what it means to live in a fire-adapted ecosystem, that fire is part of our landscape, and we just need to be prepared to live with fire. And a big part of this is our volunteer ambassador program, our neighborhood ambassador program. And so that's what I'm going to spend a lot of the presentation time today on, explaining how our ambassador approach works. Sorry, my presentation locked up. See, here we go. So just a little bit about our geography, since it seems like we have people from all over the country. So we are in the far southwest corner of Colorado. We pretty much go from the Four Corners area over to Wolf Creek Pass, if you're familiar with that, the New Mexico state line, all the way up to kind of the town of Silverton. So that is approximately 100,000 people and almost 1.4 acres of private land across 5 counties. We have a large second home population and absentee landowners, which presents a whole nother thing to think about when you live in rural areas or someone who may only be there for 2 weeks out of the year. But approximately 90% of our residents live in the wildland urban interface, or the WUI, and these are the people who are at highest risk for loss, or for fire and loss of property. And so our elevation is pretty high. We vary from 6,000 feet to over 14,000. So it's pretty broad range with the different kinds of vegetation, but mostly ponderosa pine and gamble oak understory. And I just say that because really treatments and types of treatments can vary on where you are. And one of the things about the ponderosa pine forest is that traditionally or historically, it would have burned probably, it varies, but on average about every 20 years. And so that's something we need residents to know, is that they live in an area that is meant to burn, and it's meant to do that to get out the understory. So on low intensity fires, and that's a big part of our messaging. So our mitigation incentive programs, just a little quick overview on this. And if there's more questions at the end, I can go into that. But doing mitigation can be expensive, especially if you have a lot of property, or if you have a house that has trees and vegetation right up next to it and they become hazard trees and have extra costs associated with that. So as an organization, we provide to residents in our area free home wildfire risk assessment. So we can come and do an assessment of that property to Colorado State Forest Service guidelines. And then depending on grant funding we have, we can help offset up to 50% usually for what we call our defensible space. So people who want efforts to change the vegetation according to our scope of work out 150 feet from the home. And then additionally, we have a chipper rebate program. So this is another way to have a small amount of funding. So for individuals, it's up to $250, and an HOA $1,500 back to expense of renting a chipper or hiring a crew to do it. And it's another way to invest in our local residents to do the work themselves. And maybe they have the manpower but don't have the funding to do it. So we can provide the education and some incentive funding. And this picture here in the middle is our slash depot. This is a big one. If people clear, how do they get rid of brush? So we have communities that have come together to plan and carry out chipper or air curtain burner ways to get rid of slash for an entire whole area around one lake here in town. We also have mini grants and kind of what we call Kickstart. So those are community level grants where we would help beyond an individual parcel, but maybe roadside thinning or common space treatments to help the community as a whole. So safe evacuation is definitely something to think about in a lot of communities in rural Colorado that may have only one way in and one way out. So there are incentives for both individuals and on a community level. And a lot of these are tied to our neighborhood ambassador program. So this is a program that established well before my time, but it is something that's pretty unique to our program, and the way we can capitalize and expand on volunteers to help with the workforce element. As an organization, we are very small. We have 6 employees, although not everyone's full-time, so just over 5 FTE in the end to cover 5-county region. So we have very limited resources. So this program really provides the catalyst. So we recruit ambassadors, or these are just volunteers who understand the risk of their neighborhood, and they want to work within that to help get work done on the ground or make their neighbors more aware of the risk they have. So they are the catalyst, these individuals, for their community. And so as an organization, we provide training and ongoing support, education, and access to other wildfire information experts. So we may have people from the Forest Service or the Colorado State Forest Service, fire protection districts. And there we know that their capacity is limited as well, but through our regular meetings with volunteers, we can bring those people in to have connections with those individuals. And this could be messaging about prescribed fire efforts, grant opportunities. So we provide that catalyst to bring these together, I guess, connection. And so currently we have about 145 volunteer ambassadors working in 105 communities throughout Southwest Colorado. And to put that in perspective, we started this program back in 2004 and we had 11. So we've definitely grown quite a bit and have been able to keep momentum going for some of these communities. So just as an idea of what these individuals are able to accomplish. So we, as an organization, we don't have a ton that we require of our ambassadors. They can do whatever makes most sense to them. If they're really good about planning events, or if they are really good about just welcoming a welcoming committee, or doing community wildfire protection plans and really coming up with plans. It's really whatever their strong points are, they can use to help their community. So we just ask them to track their in-kind hours, their volunteer time of doing mitigation work, education, all of that, and their neighbors. And on average, we have about 20,000 volunteer hours, which is pretty incredible when you think of that. Could be just under 10 FTE for actual employees getting work done. And so this does have a value on this, and it can be well over $500,000. And another great thing about our ambassadors is that we've had 5 that have been recognized nationally for wildfire mitigation awards since 2015. We have 21 Firewise USA sites, which is NFPA's recognition of communities that are doing effort or having efforts and plans in place to protect their community as a whole. And then also NFPA has their wildfire prep day annually, the first Saturday in May, and usually about at least 20 of our communities plan events. And in these 2 pictures down here, this was a work day, and up above, they worked with the local fire protection district to do some driveway checks. So they brought in trucks to see if the truck could actually turn around in a driveway. And then that was really eye-opening to a lot of the residents of, like, they always think the fire protection district's going to come to their house if there's a fire, but in rural areas, that's not always the case. So one community that has been an ambassador community from the start is Falls Creek Ranch. It's north of Durango. As I mentioned, 5 of those ambassadors have received national awards, and 2 have come from this neighborhood. This picture down here was the most recent one from 2018, and our ambassador here, Paulette Church, was recognized nationally. So they are a unique community in HOA that they have 900 acres, but there's only 100 of those are 1 acre private lots. So they have 800 acres of common space, which is a huge amount of property to try to manage. And when they first started this community, they weren't allowed to cut any trees. It was just not allowed. You had to keep the forest as is. It's very overgrown, lots of ponderosa. And they were affected by the Valley Fire in 2002, which was at the same time as the Missionary Ridge Fire. And so they became one of the first ambassadors. They had a CWPP as 2011. They've done a great job of setting up a committee as part of their HOA. And the ambassador sits on that, but there's also people to help share the workload. And because of that, they've been able to really be great with succession planning. So we've had 3 or 4 different ambassadors because people get burned out. It's volunteers, life changes. They may move from the area. They have a grandchild born. So they can't commit to what they, for indefinite amount of time. But they've been really good about a working ranch. And so they plan community work days, but they make it a social event as well. So there's always a potluck after, and they celebrate and get to know their neighbors. They've been really great with buying equipment. They are definitely one of the more, I guess they have a lot more common dues and funding to go after grants and have matching funds for that, but they've used it really well in purchasing equipment that they can use long term. So the one thing about this community, and when we talk about ambassador approach or what we're trying to accomplish, so yes, we're working with volunteers, but ultimately we're hoping that there's that buy-in from the community, that they continually do mitigation work on the ground. And because of that, they are ready when a fire happens, because it's not a question of if, but when, especially in our area, a fire will occur. And so this community highlights what we hope would happen in any event with an ambassador community, in that in 2018, the 416 fire started north of Durango. It was very dry. It was a very dry year, and it started coming towards the south towards Durango. And the incident commander wasn't sure how they were going to be able to get in there to stop the progression of the fire. And so the local fire protection district chief, Dowdy here from Durango Fire at the bottom, he kind of said, I know Falls Creek Ranch. I know what they've been doing for 15 years. You can get in there safely and stop this fire from progressing. And that's what happened. So we're pretty lucky that NFPA created a short video, kind of talking to some of these people about the success of this community. So I'm going to share that now. And let me know if the volume doesn't come through. Let's see if I can get this going. Be okay on sound?
It was a typical weekday morning, and we got a call that there was a brush fire that had started.
At first we could see this plume of smoke. It seemed like it was quite a ways away, and I thought, well, it'll never get here,
In the first 5 minutes, it went from being a start to almost 5 acres, and in the next 5 minutes, they were calling it maybe 25 acres. So it was spreading incredibly rapidly.
And we went on pre-evac, and we saw it approach closer and closer, and it's still quite a ways away. I thought they'll stop it before it gets here, not realizing how intense it was.
And I said to him, Falls Creek is an area that we can stop this fire at. The reason is that they've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it's well mitigated, and it's a fire-wise community, and we have the ability to slow this thing down and stop it at Falls Creek. I believe that we can save that neighborhood. They started basing their actions on the contingency that, hey, when the fire gets to Falls Creek, that's where it's going to turn the corner.
This neighborhood has committed for the last 10 plus years to reducing their wildfire risk, and they've really taken ownership of the fact that they live in an area that's prone to wildfires. They've decided that they're going to take responsibility for their land and reducing that wildfire risk to give these firefighters a chance when they come into this community.
In the back of my mind, I thought these guys are going to save this place.
The area where we turned it westward and we stopped it from coming into the community of Durango, this was the pivotal neighborhood. This was the fight that won the war.
We helped them save it. And that was a big compliment to us to hear them, firemen, professionals, say, you did a good job here. That made us feel really good. And it's not just us, it's the whole ranch.
There's no guarantees in this line of work, but what they can do is they can stack the deck in their favor. And this community has accepted that, and in this situation, they really saw the effectiveness of how that work it really improves the odds when it comes to major wildfire moving through.
I think any homeowner's responsibility living in a forest like we do is help these firemen protect your home. Fire, you don't know if one's going to happen today or tomorrow or when. You can be in denial, but it's a possibility. You have to accept that responsibility. You love the forest, but you're going to have to clear around your home if you want to keep your home. Sometimes you make your own luck. And I think that's what we did. We were very fortunate to have the people, the fire resources here available for us, but it's nice to know that we helped them. defend our house.
Protecting your home against the ravages of wildland fire, if you live in a community like this, I mean, that should be as high a priority for you as mowing your lawn.
If you can even do that first 30 feet around your home, then that's going to significantly increase the odds of that structure's survival.
How can you ask somebody to defend your house if you don't want to help them? That's the thing, you know, you got to help them. All they want is a fighting chance.
So I think to come back, drive in my driveway, see that fire truck sitting in my driveway still, and those guys there.
I get emotional once you know the people.
You know, we had been told that our house had burned. People just insisted. 3 people just said, I know it did. I know for a fact. So to drive in here and find those firefighters standing here greeting us, I'll just never forget them, ever. I hope that I get to see them and visit with them again.
So I think that video does a great job of really showing, you know, a great success story of how we what we're trying to accomplish through our ambassadors. But it also shows a bit about the pride and investment that the community has too. These are invested, they live here, they want to protect their community. So we're trying to help them and provide them with the resources so that they can do just that. I just have a couple more slides, really just kind of summarizing the benefits of our approach. You know, we can extend reach. They can be more effective FAC and practitioners. And I think one of the things in the FAC wheel, I wrote a blog post a few months ago about how this approach, it is kind of set in there as partnerships and community engagement, but through ambassador work, we can really touch all of those pie pieces in that chart. You can do evacuation, recovery, resident mitigation. So through this, we can expand on and expand the reach of our efforts. We set an example. So all of our ambassadors have the good D space, their example for their neighbors. And then they can also help and guide this program beyond their neighborhoods. So another big point about our organization is we meet regularly, and these practitioners and these ambassadors can learn from each other. Someone who's been doing it for 10 years can learn from someone's new, and they probably are experiencing similar hurdles. And then we can also show in the storytelling of tracking these volunteer hours to get more money and grant money into doing these projects. And they can function at a variety of scales. You know, we do it as a neighborhood at HOA, but we have self-defined communities. It might be a road, a fire protection district, county, regionally. And then it just improved awareness of agencies and community efforts, and knowing who to contact within that to get messaging out. And so through this approach, we, back in 2018, with some money from Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network, we came up with kind of a guide or principles, enabling conditions of how to replicate this kind of program across the country and other areas. And so since 2019, and I'll put in the chat a link to that toolkit that we did, the document, we've been able to hold, so myself and Rebecca Samolsky of Fire Adapted Colorado, who used to work for our organization as well, has done them probably 6 or 7 times, where we've had workshops, 2-day workshops of going through the steps of things to think about if you want to launch a similar program. And so this map over here was an exercise we did, just showing where efforts are going on across the West. We have a couple in the East, but kind of some that are the furthest along. Tahoe RCD, they have neighborhood leaders. New Mexico, the Greater Santa Fe Fireshed Collaborative, they have some. There's an effort going on kind of the Greater Yellowstone across these 3 states up here. COPE, Northern Sonoma County, they really incorporated and expanded their volunteers to work beyond fire in all emergencies. Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, they have a really great program going where they've trained up their ambassadors to do the site assessments. And then in Colorado, the statewide, we have efforts going on to kind of build resources on a statewide level for other organizations like mine who might work in a place-based area. So we have 5 pretty established ambassador programs there as well, trying to use this approach, or whatever you want to call it, neighborhood leaders, ambassadors, but really trying to capitalize on volunteer and capacity. So that's all I have for that one, but yeah, and I will put that link in there and then be ready for questions at the end. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Ashley. That was a great video. I think really striking illustration of what these community efforts can do. Yeah. Great. Okay, Helen, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay.
Let me share my screen. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, so I'm a late add-on to this to this workshop, and oops, sorry, do it this way. I'm a late add-on to this workshop, and I was asked to give a Southeastern perspective. If you can't tell, I'm from the South, based on my accent. I sit in the foothills of the Appalachian Range on the campus of Clemson University. I work for the U.S. Forest Service in research, fire ecology research, and spent about the last first 10 to 12 years of my career really digging deep into how do we reestablish fire in the Appalachian region, prescribed fire. And when we reestablish prescribed fire programs on the ground, what impact does that have on fuels and vegetation? But where my real love is partnerships and taking that really great science that's on the ground to our land managers and seeing that great science be put to work in a multitude of ways. And so with that, I was able to 12, 13 years ago apply for a grant through the Joint Fire Science Program, and that is the Joint Fire Science Knowledge Exchange Network. And that network, if you guys can see my map, let me go back, I'm sorry. So if you can see my map here, that exchange network covers the entire country. I direct the Appalachian, but I work in partnership with all of those fire exchange networks across the country. So the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists spends a lot of time building partnerships, like I said, around a multitude of different things, working closely with those around us. And the mission of the Knowledge Exchange Network is to facilitate the flow of information between fire science and fire management. So science, good fire science to our managers, and management, our science needs from our managers back to our scientists. We found that before this network existed, that we had scientists doing sciencey things and managers doing manager things, and no one was talking. And so now we're getting at a lot of our challenges and having a lot of success in partnerships with a really open, well line of communication around these topics. And so we work in tandem, very regularly on a almost weekly basis. So I want to hit on something that's just completely different when we think of fire in the East, especially fire in the Southeast. And that is that culturally fire is very well accepted here in the Southeast. I like to put it in these terms, that great grandpa burned the farm, and when great grandpa burned the farm, that neighbors came, everyone from town came. It was a great day. We spent the time outdoors burning the land together. We then, after we burned the land together, we sat down and we had a wonderful meal with our neighbors and our family. So when we think of fire in the Southeast, there's more of a, as odd as this sounds, there's more of a warm connotation around that, right? Because we spent time outdoors with our family and our neighbors, and we've cared for the land through prescribed fire. So this is a very, very different perspective than when we think about fire in the West. We don't have, the vast, large fires that we have in the West here, as many of you know, or most of you know, in the Southeast. A lot of that's attributed to many decades of burning lands. the large proportion of lands in the Southeast are privately owned, so not publicly owned. And there are folks in the private sector that that sometimes we lean on because they, as agencies, we don't burn nearly as well as they do on their own lands with their neighbors.
Hey,
So
Helen,
that's
I'm
led
gonna
to.
interrupt you real quick because we're not seeing your slides.
Uh-oh, I'm sorry.
There you go.
Are you
Thank
seeing
you.
it now?
Yep.
Okay. So this first slide is that Fire Science Exchange Network that I previously spoke about. And and I've got my slides, admittedly, I put them together this morning because I signed on for this yesterday. So these are mostly just kind of for reminders, but I wanted mostly just to tell you guys, our story in terms of how the Southeast looks at fire, how we approach fire, and how we work with partnerships and building capacity through the next generation of fire folks. So when we think about partnerships, they happen in a multitude of ways. They happen between state and federal agencies, of course. They happen between the Knowledge Exchange Network and all of those agencies. But there's also a lot of partnerships between our private landowners and states and federal governments. And so the lines are very blurry because we all work together on a very, very regular basis. And some of that is, how do we effectively get fire back in our some places like our state and federal lands? And some of that is based around, how do we empower people to burn their own lands based on information sharing with neighbors through prescribed burn associations, where neighbors come together and help one another burn their own lands. Sometimes we do that outreach through fire festivals in our communities where fire is prevalent. And then sometimes that interfacing with the public is through learn and burns, where folks show up and we just burn a plot of land and help them understand the reason we do it and the benefits of doing that type of work. These partnerships, as you can see on this page, there's the consortium, the Southern Fire Exchange is the other knowledge exchange network across the Southeast and mostly the Piedmont and coastal ranges of the Southeast, where fire really in those ranges has been, prescribed fire has been put on the ground much longer than the Appalachians. The Appalachians, we've worked in the last 20 years to put fire back in those ecosystems through prescribed fire. And so partnerships has been key in how to do that, how to do it effectively, where to do it, and ecologically, what impacts are we having when we do that. So these partnerships stretch far and wide. The FLN, as Michelle spoke about earlier, as part of the Nature Conservancy's larger effort on many fronts, but the Fire Learning Network has been key in bringing partners together in many ways. So whether if that be communities, or bringing the science to the table to the managers, or just hashing out management needs. The Southern Blue Ridge Treks and other treks around the country is also a Nature Conservancy effort, and that's where we spend a lot of time burning federal, state, and private lands. But through that process, we're helping to develop workforces with really good quality training on the ground, and seeing the outcomes of that, of engaging the public, but also engaging our fire practitioners and our fire managers across the region. So we can't do the work we do without these partnerships. The Southeast burns the most by prescribed fire anywhere in the country, and on an annual basis. Like I said earlier, large wildfires aren't as prevalent here, but we do have some of the highest wildland-urban interface you'll find anywhere in the country. And that's only constantly changing because of the influx of folks moving to the Southeast as a destination for the friendliness and our moderate climate and other things. So although we sit in the Southeast and we feel we feel great and we do a lot in terms of our prescribed fire programs, we also sit on the edge of our chairs a little bit, because we feel like if we don't continue to teach and to partner and to engage with the public and in really positive ways, that we might lose culturally what we've built for generations, because those new people moving in don't understand and don't have that emotional connection to the land that culturally Southerners have had for generations through the family farm and family woodlands that have been managed. It's not uncommon for acres and acres of woodlands to be managed to pay for college educations in families and those types of things, to buy a new home, those types of things. So it's entrenched in Southerners to care for the land, but we do sit on the edge of our seats in terms of losing that connection, and work very hard with partners to continue to maintain those connections. Let's see, I can kind of hop all over the place there. So I hope I can continue to be coherent and kind of telling our story. In the West, I think a lot of relationships in terms of fire practitioners and those at the table at FLN meetings, in fact, fire adapted communities and all of those pieces, those relationships in the professional world have been built in the wildfire context for the most part. In the Southeast, a lot of those relationships have been built in the prescribed fire context. So we will join together and do a lot of prescribed burning together, but we don't fight a lot of wildfires together. And so one great success story is our local fire learning network here in the South Carolina mountains has this great plan. We have this goal of burning across jurisdictional lines. So, our maps have lots of lines, who owns what. But what we want to do is erase those lines and begin to think about fire and putting fire on the ground at a landscape level. So we want to transition to burning 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 acres at a time. But in order to do that, because land is fragmented in the South, we rely on our partners, and we all have to show up on the fire line of a prescribed burn, and work together to burn from Forest Service land to DNR land to Duke Energy land, and sometimes even over onto private land as well, very commonly. So that's where our relationships were built, and those relationships are strong and important to us. And in 2016, the Appalachians, much like this season, but worse than this season, had a pretty active wildland fire season in the fall of 2016. And here in the South Carolina mountains, the largest mountain wildfire in the state ever it started an escaped campfire. And because all those partners came to the table and worked together with prescribed fire, it made fighting this wildfire so much easier, because we knew partners to the west, we knew the partners to the east. We knew that we could push our fire lines over onto DNR land, and that we knew we could dip water out of the Greenville watershed, who was a fabulous partner. And those relationships didn't have to be built on the fly in a high stress situation where you're making decisions very rapidly and trying to save communities. And these relationships that we had built through prescribed fire paid dividends in fighting that wildfire. And we talk about that still. Those dividends are continuing to pay this year. We just finished up the Southern Blue Ridge Treks here again in the South Carolina mountains, and it was too dry to do prescribed burning. So we were able to step over and help with wildfire suppression with all of our partner agencies, the North Carolina Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and others, because that trust has already been built. And that trust building over the years is paying dividends in fighting wildfire, but in also managing lands with fire. And that extends, like I said already, to everyone out there, from private landowners to federal agencies, to state agencies, to nonprofits, anyone in that arena. And so we think constantly about living with fire, and that is our reality, is that we have to live with fire. And Michelle already indicated some of that earlier and talked some about, and Ashley as well. And we have to think outside the box, and we have to think in partnership terms. And here in the Southeast, we've been successful in forging those partnerships through, like I said, the prescribed fire programs, but translating over into wildfires. So let me switch gears a little bit.
Helen, I'm just going to jump in real quick. Sorry,
Yeah.
I don't mean to cut you off. Maybe just a couple more minutes here so we have plenty of time for questions.
Okay, yeah,
That's
sure.
okay?
So yeah, so the other part of this little piece I know today is thinking about diversity in our workforces. And so I do want to mention some great efforts that are going on here in the Southeast in terms of mentoring the next generation of fire professionals. Region 8 of the U.S. Forest Service has a new women's fire crew. I have a fire crew out of Clemson University, the Fire Tigers, which brings in young people who in their undergraduate programs to work in fire. And then the FireGen Collaborative, which is a group of students mostly based in the West, but some here in the Southeast that I work with very regularly. And that's how do we empower our younger folks in this world of fire. And they're the next generation. I'm close to retirement, and those next people coming in are going to be key into solving some of these problems and helping folks live with fire and live with fire in a good way. So these efforts have been really, really successful here in the Southeast and are continuing to be successful. So not only are these crews doing prescribed burning and doing wildfire, but they're also at the table to talk about next week, in fact, invasives in fire and the concerns we have around invasives in fire. So integrating that science piece, that fire science piece, into the operational piece is key, and something that we are actively doing here in the Southeast. And then this is just my contact information. Our knowledge exchange network in the Appalachians is appalachianfire.org. We run a Twitter and a Facebook page with AP Fire Science. And then you can see my consortium email or my Forest Service email there at the bottom. And so I'll just keep it brief and look forward to talking more about these partnerships and these next generation firefighters and fire practitioners and fire scientists and all those things that Michelle listed earlier in terms of musicians and artists and all of those pieces that we have to have. But I guess I want to just wrap it up in that the fact that partner work is long and hard, but it's very fruitful. Sometimes it's very slow, and then sometimes it's very fast. And being adaptable, just like you are in a wildfire, and partner work is probably the most important skill, and I think probably has led to the most success here in the Southeast. So I'll just wrap it up there, and that way we have plenty of time for conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Helen. That was great. Okay. Murphy, you are first out of the gate.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This is probably best for Helen, but I'd love to hear any responses from others. You know, I was looking through prescribed fire data a month or so ago. I guess I had like a basic understanding that it was just a bigger thing in the Southeast, but I was honestly just kind of blown away by just how much the Southeast accounts for annual acreage of prescribed burns. Helen, you were kind of pointing towards some kind of like cultural explanations for its acceptance. But I guess I'd just like to hear any other thoughts you have just about how prescribed burning has just become such a common large scale thing in the Southeast, and to what degree that could be replicated elsewhere in the country.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, a lot of it is just tied to all of that private land ownership, those private landowners understanding the benefits of prescribed fire on their lands, that it leads to healthy forests, and those healthy forests are more productive. Our private landowners in the Southeast are growing trees for money. And so when you've got money attached to a task, sometimes the attention to detail is greater. And so that's where some of that has come from. Like I said earlier, sometimes our federal and state agencies are trying to keep up with our private landowners, and especially in terms of the Piedmont and coastal plain. So, Yeah, so how do we, we've been tasked in recent years in terms of being a good partner to the rest of the country, especially our Western friends, on how do we operationally burn so much? How do we approach communities? How do we have these conversations with people? And so we have a lot of crews here come to the Southeast for our prescribed fire season, mid-January through mid-April, and they interface with our crews here on the ground and learned the fundamentals of prescribed burning, and not just burning to make the ground black, but burning for ecological benefit. And that differs depending on what that site looks like. Sometimes we're burning for an endangered species. Sometimes we're burning for a threatened tree. Sometimes we're burning for a wildlife species, and we're very specific in the Southeast and where we're burning and what we're burning for. And it's somewhat of an art in terms of being able to really pinpoint and control the intensity of those fires and the good that we can do with those fires. But that's taken time to understand that and learn that skill and learn that art. So we have really enjoyed having, for the last 7 or 8 years, Western crews here in the Southeast, working alongside us and learning alongside us. And yeah, so even some of the infrastructure money has gone to helping those crews get here and us interface with those crews, and that knowledge is sharing across the country. We get a lot of questions from the West, especially on how do we make it work, just what you just asked me. And I don't think there's any one perfect way other than building these partnerships, continuing to communicate, carrying drip torches together on the fire line. It does wonders. I know that sounds crazy, but it does wonders for forging partnerships and friendships. I very often say that the Appalachian region, we have worked to form a fire family. So sure, we're all professionals and we're all colleagues, but really we depend on each other as if we're a family, because when one land management agency is having challenges around something, they reach out to the others, and we're always there to support. It happened last month with an invasive issue on a watershed. They reached out to the rest of the partners, and now next month we'll have a workshop on invasives and fire. It's really inspiring, and it's what keeps me going day to day. So I hope that opens your eyes or helps you see how some of those pieces work.
Thanks a lot. Drip torches are super fun.
Sarah, you're up next.
Thanks. I'm working right now in communities that have quite a bit of economic and political incentives to burn. Maybe they look like the great grandpas that Helen, you were referring to, that are in your region. But it's also in ecosystems that aren't actually meant to burn as often as they're currently burning. And so I wanted to ask the three of you, what are some strategies that you would apply when you're trying to work with communities that actually need less fire, or to ask Helen, how fire was first unintroduced in Appalachia?
Well, maybe I could just jump in real fast. I think while working with fire is certainly a really strong entry point for a lot of people to really develop that relationship, it's hard to replace actually holding a drip torch and understanding how fire works. There's a lot of other entry points we see communities making. So as Ashley talked about, sometimes people are organizing because they're concerned about their homes and their own personal safety. And so I think recognizing that there's lots of valid entry points into this work, and that those don't have to be a stopping point, that you can go from trying to work on organizing your neighborhood and thinking about safety and evacuation and maybe structure hardening and preparedness, to also using prescribed fire, or maybe to thinking about how maybe understanding how fire should or shouldn't behave in your ecosystem. So I guess I just say, share the wheel with people and think about how valid all of those things are. Sometimes we hear from communities who would rather have you save their hay stack and their fencing than save their ranch house. And so you can't make assumptions about what's important and valuable in different communities. And I think making sure that communities have the opportunity to voice their own values is one of the most important things we can do.
Yeah, I'll just add that, for us in our ecosystem, we are probably, like I said, a 20-year interval it should be happening, and we may be at 200 years since fire's been on the ground. So that's definitely not something we have dealt with. But a lot of what we do in education-wise and as connections between the experts is trying to get that social buy-in for prescribed fire. So trying to help people understand that this is what needs to be on the ground. This is what natural ignition looks like into prescribed fire. That was what we had last week. So we actually had someone from the Forest Service come on and share, it was a lightning strike and it was all in a planned boundary. And so they let it burn, managed the burn, I should say. So I think for us, a lot of our communities, if they do any kind of fire, it's going to be pile burning more often than not. But that's, for taking fire off the landscape, that's not something that is needed in our area. But we have a lot of ways in to try to get that buy-in socially from the community.
I'll touch on the piece of what exactly did you ask again, Sarah? I'm sorry, about why are we in this scenario of where we're trying to reintroduce fire? Okay.
Yeah, in Appalachia, how did fire get unintroduced away from great grandfathers or whoever was burning?
Yeah, I think part of it, it's, a combination of things. Part of it is wild and urban interface. The Blue Ridge is amazing, right? It's a beautiful place, but it's also within a reasonable vicinity to large cities, Asheville and Charlotte, just thinking of the Southern Blue Ridge. So you have a lot of this wild and urban interface moving in, making it more difficult, making these large, vast areas of private ownership not as easy to keep fire in that box because of that encroachment of people, but also hard to keep in that box with the encroachment of people because burning in the mountains is harder. There's slope, there's we can't put a tractor plow around a burn unit like we can in the Piedmont and the coastal plain where it's flat. We have to put a hand line and, just more labor intensive. So when we start to see culturally some of this land ownership change in the Piedmont or the coastal plain, our private landowners are still able to burn there because the complexity of those prescribed burn units is less because it's flat. The land is flat, it's open, and it's easy to put a fire line around. You've got contractors that can come in and do that for you for, 2 or 3 folks can do that in a day's time at a very reasonable cost. But when we look at the mountains, there's an operational challenge there with putting that fire on the ground because it's so steep and it's just not easy. So so we saw this slippage of burning in the mountains, and then our partners, mostly federal and state partners, have brought it back to the mountains, and now we're trying to educate those homeowners that are in the mountains and those landowners in the mountains how to do it again. And some of those folks have been there and grandpa did burn, but there was a gap there. And now some of those folks are just not necessarily from the South and have moved in and bought tracts of forest land, but see the value through their neighbors of prescribed fire on those lands and want to learn that craft and how that skill and how to do it themselves.
Great. Okay, Grant, you're up next.
Hi, my name is Grant Stringer. I'm a freelancer in Portland, Oregon. But I used to live in Denver, so I had a question, I think, for Ashley, although Michelle, you might be able to speak to this too. When we're kind of thinking about what a fire adapted community looks like, it struck me that it's like a really holistic definition and approach that you all have of like trying to meet people where they're at and engage with people to tailor some kind of way forward that's like best for that particular community. And I've written a lot about homelessness in the Mountain West and smaller communities. And I know Durango has been grappling with this. So I wanted to ask Ashley how your work, or if your work kind of engages or does outreach with unhoused people who can and do start unwanted fires. So I guess that would be in the category of kind of keeping unwanted fire out of areas where it might be destructive.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It is something we've definitely grappled with. And I will say our former La Plata County coordinator who was in that video, Charlie Landsman, worked with, during the 416 fire, they had to move the unhoused camp, and they moved it to one spot. And I should say it was a combination between the city of Durango and the county. And just, and then with Durango fire, there were some fire starts. And so they had to put kind of a fire stop around where they moved them. And eventually, they ended up having to disperse that camp because the risk was too high of where they were in using those. And politically, it's a touchy subject because now it goes beyond our organization and the wildfire risk. There's no place camp, a permanent camp for them. So it is something we've grappled with, and I don't know that we have the answer, but I know from a lot of other practitioners in other places, it's always a thought of how to incorporate that. It's just another way. It's not everybody is going to be in a subdivision that needs that outreach or that can do this kind of work. So Michelle, you probably have a better some additional examples from other places around the country too, from other partners.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. We actually had a whole kind of learning group in our network who were trying to think about how to engage their unhoused community members. And sometimes that conversation was sort of around how are we going to make sure that cooking and warming fires don't pose a risk to our built infrastructure in the community. But a lot of people recognize that that created sort of an us and them conversation a lot of the time, and didn't really speak to the humanity of their entire community. And so people were also trying to think about, well, how do we understand the needs of our unhoused community members? How do we talk with them about how to build safer fires if they're going to do it? And so some of the interesting things that came out is a lot of our fire department members felt really politically kind of between a rock and a hard place because they're responsible for stopping unwanted fires, but then a lot of them also run a lot of the outreach in their communities. And so I think I don't know that we had a bunch of answers either. We had a lot of different kind of test projects, working with food banks, like really trying to think about different routes to reach those community members and understand their needs was a lot of what people worked on. But I think it is a great question. It's really important. There's a lot of really practical factors. How do you stay safe from smoke if you can't go indoors? How do you deal with evacuation if you maybe don't live there full time or don't, like, where are you going to evacuate to? So there's a whole bunch of dimensions, and I could definitely connect you with some of the people who are working on those projects in a variety of places across the West if you're interested.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it.
All right, Lindsay, you're up.
Hi, thank you all so much for the presentation today and for being here with us. I cover adaptation in my work, and when it comes to other climate caused or exacerbated hazards, there's a lot of talk around managed retreat or planned relocation of communities away from risks. And I'd be curious to hear any or all of your thoughts around whether planned relocation is an appropriate adaptation when it comes to wildfires, sort of on any level.
This is such a good question. I think that it's really interesting how the kind of risk issue becomes a lever for different interest groups. So I see a lot of like conservation organizations trying to make the case that we need to not repopulate areas, or that we need to plan exoduses from areas. And well, I think there's absolutely some risk we cannot mitigate. You can't change the slope of a lot. And if you have a community that's in a box canyon, like there's only so much you can do. But at least personally, I live in California. We have a housing crisis here. I just don't know where we're going to put people. Like there are so many layers of natural hazard that like I can't reconcile the numbers of just people who are going to be displaced from risky situations with where to put them. And while I get that there are some parts of fire that we can't change, of all of those natural hazards, we do have the opportunity to build in ways that can protect people, and people can prepare for fire. Like we have some more tools when it comes to wildfire as a natural hazard. And so I don't personally advocate for a lot of retreat. I think that we should be very thoughtful when we rebuild, instead of rushing to rebuild and fast tracking permits to put things on the exact footprint. We should take the opportunity to say, what are our setbacks? Because once you build a building envelope, that risk is like permanently in place until you burn that town down again. And so I think we have some really good opportunities to make better decisions. But I don't see a ton of practicality in sort of the idea that we can just stop building in a bunch of places. Hayfork, where I live, is on the top 10 list of risk places in California, but it's a great place to live. Indigenous people have lived here since the beginning of time. It's a valley floor. We have an oak woodland. Like, this is a place for humans to inhabit. So I think we can look to the kind of environments that support human life and try to think about how to return fire regimes to those that can make that be a future fire environment that's also survivable.
Yeah, I'll just add, in Colorado, it's the same thing. We're growing so fast that most people are going into the wildland urban interface. But the state legislature did set up a panel or a group of people to come up with a statewide WUI code that would really affect new builds. So like Michelle said, there's ways that we can try to incorporate that to really help if people are still moving into the highest risk areas, but we can have some codes that limit the risk overall for those communities.
Awesome. Claire, you are up next.
Thanks, everyone. My question is for Helen. Helen, I'm a reporter at the Post and Courier in Charleston, so you're just down the street. You mentioned that, and obviously I'm familiar with the culture of burning in the Piedmont, that it's only really been the past 20 years that bringing fire to the upstate, to the Appalachian region. And I know the 2016 fires that were deadly here kind of were a big wake-up call. What do you think were the biggest lessons learned for fire management after the 2016 wildfires that had some that were so destructive?
Yeah, good question. I think the very largest of those was looking at our workforce at the national level. Before 2016, all of our fire crews at the federal level rolled off at their seasonal positions mid-October. And our fires got rolling mid-October. And if many of you remember the Chimney Tops 2 fire, which is the Gatlinburg fire, which was a part of that fire season. This year, our fire season was it was very bad, but not quite at the level we were in 2016. But the differences between this year and 2016 were remarkable in terms of the workforce available to us from the West to come here and help. In 2016, all of our crews had rolled off. They were all on their off season, and that was a big eye opener that we need to begin to think about our fire workforce as a year-round workforce. And it's not anymore a season; it's year-round. And especially when you look at the United States and the world really as a whole, because now we're sending crews very regularly to Canada and Australia and other places. So there were days here in the southern Appalachians that we could not get any air support because there were no helicopters on contract and because they had all rolled off contract for the season. So very largest lesson learned was workforce and equipment and pre-positioning a lot of that equipment and workforce. This year, when our indices got to the point where they were tracking like they were in 2016, we started pre-positioning crews, Western crews here to come give us a hand. And so we didn't have this sense of panic of where are we going to get people. But the other piece was what I talked about earlier with our partnerships here already existing. We transitioned a whole TREX training event that had 60 burn units, prescribed fire burn units ready to burn in the South Carolina mountains. We transitioned 3 crews, about 60 people from prescribed burning to wildfire overnight. And what
day was that?
Say that. What was your
What
question?
what date did that happen?
So that happened the first 2 weeks of November. So the first 2 weeks in November, we had a treks, the Southern Blue Ridge treks in the mountains of South Carolina. Wildfires started popping. So overnight, we transitioned from that prescribed fire operation to wildfire operations. And that 100% was based on relationships and partnerships. The ICs at those fires, the incident commanders at those fires, wildfires that were breaking out, were calling us because they trusted us and because they knew we had crews here with experienced people. So yeah, partnerships, building partnerships through prescribed fire and wildfire and community work and anywhere we can in the world of fire, right? Partnerships, 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 and they all matter and they're all important and they all emerge at these different times. Earlier, I said partnerships are hard and they can move slow and they can move fast. Well, they moved fast the first 2 weeks of November, and the doors were open for us to help local resources. So, yeah, so I'll stop there.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Helen. I think Bethany, you've got the last one for the session.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Bethany Brookshire. I'm a freelancer. And first of all, Helen, I'm from Appalachia as well. So in fact, I drove through the fire burning up Pisgah on the way to Thanksgiving this year. That was fun. But my question is actually for Ashley. So you've mentioned earlier, and we all know that the population of Colorado has just exploded in the past couple decades, most particularly in central and northern Colorado, but it affects the entire state. How has the influx of all of this new population, many of whom are not used to living in fire country at all, changed or affected the community fire preparedness?
I think that's a great question. It's something we grapple with in our part of the state. We have a lot of second homeowners, as I mentioned, and a lot of them come from Texas in our area. So they may not understand what it means to, or from back east, they may not understand what it means to burn as regularly as we do in Colorado and the risks that we have and what we've grown to recognize on that level. And so one of the other things as a fire adapted community, and one thing we talked about is businesses. So I've worked pretty closely with the Durango Association of Realtors and helping them to understand what, they're the first point of contact. So getting some of these people who are moving in, who may not understand that, just starting off, it's kind of hard. They're a hard industry because they're ultimately trying to get that sale, but they need to be aware of the risks that are there, that there's resources available, that new residents can contact our organization. So I've done some continuing ed classes for them on the home ignition zone, and just making sure that they're familiar with our program and that they can speak to it just for new people moving in. But it is something that we continually do. And that's another reason why having ambassadors who have a welcome committee for people moving in, here's some resources, here's this. And it's really changing that mentality. Like I said, that this is a fire adapted ecosystem. It's part of the landscape. We will have prescribed fire, smoke in the air. That's just the normal way things go. And so I think the more times that we can help people hear that as they're moving in or when they're new, it's going to be beneficial for them to accepting that they may have to cut some trees. A lot of them say, I moved to the forest, I don't want to cut anything. But once they see what it looks like, if they cut a few, they're like, oh, that actually looks really good. Wildlife's coming back in. So there's some perks and ways that we can do that through education, demo sites, and trying to make sure our partners are speaking to that messaging as well.
Awesome. Well, we have run out of time, folks. I know that there were like 12 more questions in the chat bar, but we're going to have to wrap up. So let's please thank Helen, Ashley, and Michelle for a really wonderful session this morning to get us kicked off for day 2. And yeah, Helen, Ashley, and Michelle, I guarantee you are going to be hearing from some of these folks because they will all be getting your contact info. And I know they all have a bunch of questions for you still. So